Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us at the 6th World Economic Forum on Latin America. This meeting takes place at a unique time for Latin America. In our history, most of our countries are now well positioned for economic growth and to engage actively on international issues. From over 46 countries, 770 top regional and global leaders have gathered here in Rio de Janeiro to address the priorities of the region's agenda on three thematic pillars. The first, regional and international governance. The second, innovation and productivity for equitable growth. The third one, effective partnerships for a sustainable development. Our theme for 2011 is laying the foundation for a Latin American decade. Such theme offers an exceptional platform for leaders to share insights and seek a common vision toward 2020. Two main questions should be addressed: where Latin America wants to be by 2020 and how to achieve that. Our common challenge is to set realistic targets to be reached by the end of next decade and express how to reach them in a global landscape that is currently transforming. On behalf of the World Economic Forum, we're in debt to the government of Rio de Janeiro for their generous support, and most especially for Governor Sergio Cabral Filho for his valuable leadership in making this meeting possible. Such recognition is also extended to our co-chairs, Federico Curado, Orit Gedish, Luis Alberto Moreno, Vikram Pandit, and Martin Sorrell, as well as to the speakers, moderators, and talented professionals that have made this summit possible. In such splendid Latin America city, a cidade maravilhosa, Rio de Janeiro, we wish you a very, very fruitful meeting. Muito obrigada. I would like to ask our host, Governor Cabral, to join us for a brief statement.
Klaus, Marisol, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Rio. Enjoy the Rio and enjoy the speeches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor.
Good evening, good afternoon. My name is Moisés Naím. I'm the chair, moderator of this session. I am a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. This initial session is to talk about the big ideas and big subjects and challenging subjects, and that is Latin America's role in the global governance system. We all know that as the world has globalized and integrated, the number of problems that any country can tackle alone have diminished. A lot of big challenges now require effective collective action. But at the same time that the demand for effective collective action by countries is soaring, the ability of the countries to work together seem to be either stagnant or declining. It is that gap that we want to discuss, how to bridge that gap, and what is the role of Latin America, what is the role of the private sector, for example, also to help in bridging the gap between the needs for multilateral action that works and what we are seeing that is very often late and ineffective. And so that's the essence of the conversation that will hopefully also bring your own opinions and interventions. I would like, of course, to start by agreement with everyone else, with our host country, and we have the privilege of having Ambassador former ambassador, now the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, Antonio de Aguiar Patriota. As you know, as you notice, I'm not introducing the panel. They are leaders, they are global leaders in a variety of ways. As I introduce them, I will briefly say who they are, but they need no introduction, and they have long and interesting resumes full of achievements. But let me start with Minister Patriota. And of course, Brazil is now a global power. Hard to imagine important negotiations going on in the world, from climate change to energy to the international financial systems redesign to trade, in which Brazil is not an indispensable player. That brings responsibilities and costs to Brazil. So, Minister Patriota, tell us about how Brazil perceives its role in this global governance, and specifically, perhaps, your role in Latin America. Big size among small neighbors also creates all sorts of anxieties. So if you could address that and give us a sense.
Bom, muito obrigado, e vou pedir permissão aqui na cidade maravilhosa, na presença do governador Sérgio Cabral, para falar inglês, que eu acho que é a língua mais disseminada na sala, e ter uma comunicação mais direta. So, exceptionally, I will speak English in my own native country and in my own hometown to address this question. I would start by making a few very brief considerations. The international geopolitical scenario is going through very accelerated change. And this has created the need for improved governance mechanisms. We have seen the G8 evolve into the G20. We have seen new attempts to coordinate multilaterally on trade issues, on environmental issues. And we've also seen frustrating attempts to reform some mechanisms, some organs that have long awaited reform, such as the United Nations Security Council, an item which is still in the international agenda, but that continues to defy some resolution. At the same time, Latin America, I think, has become an increasingly convincing success story, not only because we bounced back from the 2008 economic crisis in relatively good shape, or comparatively good shape, also because we are democratic, and our democracies have demonstrated a capacity also to reduce inequality, to promote social progress. We're also a zone of peace. There's no important conflict in our region. There may be some lingering situations, such as the internal situation in Colombia, that continue to be a challenge. But compared with any other part of the developing world in particular, this is a region of peace, also a denuclearized region, a region without weapons of mass destruction, and I could go on with many other strengths. So how do we participate in this scenario that is going through accelerated change? How do we organize ourselves? This is where Brazil has been trying to reconcile, I think, two agendas. On one hand, we will, of course, be very eager to take part in the global debates that require balanced perspectives. So we're pleased to be part of the G20. You will see us very active on the environmental front, and we will be hosting here next year Rio +20. You will see us very active at the WTO, as we have been, in trying to improve governance in that context as well, as you will see on peace and security and other issues. But as we assume greater individual responsibility, I think there's a growing sense in Brazil that our future is inextricably linked to our neighborhood. And when I speak of our neighborhood, I think there are different configurations of neighborhood. First of all, there's Mercosul, but then we have UNASUL in South America, which is a new, relatively new configuration, but one that has very quickly assumed an identity. And then we have other forms of interacting with the region, including through a global forum that is now in the making, which is CELAC, the Community of Latin America and Caribbean States. This is how we intend to participate more actively in the global stage, not shying away from individual responsibility, but enhancing and deepening our regional contacts, especially taking into account the very significant strengths of the region that I tried to summarize in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. José Miguel Insulza has been the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Chile, the Minister of the Interior of the Presidency of Chile, and has now, for more than 5 years, been the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. Secretary Insulza, you run one of the pillars of the Latin American governance system, together with the Inter-American Development Bank that deals with economic development. You deal with a lot of the thorny, challenging political issues. Tell us, two questions, one institutional and another personal. The institutional is, what are the challenges that you see at the OAS? How can the OAS improve or develop, or tell us how do you think about developing the institution? And the second is a more personal question. What are your personal challenges of running an organization composed of 34 countries that very often don't see eye to eye and have a hard time agreeing?
Well, thank you very much, Moisés, and it's a pleasure to be here. Professor Schwab, Mr. Governor, and dear friends. Well, I would say that basic challenges, of course, come precisely of the situation that Antonio Patriota just mentioned in terms of and also Marisol, the regular speech. I mean, everybody talks about the decade of Latin America, what could be, what could happen in Latin America. Of course, that very much depends on some challenges which are very serious. One is, are we going to be able to use this decade, a privileged decade in terms of our exports and our commodities and food products, to achieve a more sustainable development? Because we've been there before. Many people don't remember that there was I would say, like a golden era of Latin America, at least in the South, in the years at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, when we exported practically everything we wanted. And those are the years in which Argentina, for example, became one of the most developed countries in the world in terms of per capita income, and Chile was about 80% of what any country of Europe was at that moment. And what happened? We just spent it all, and nothing really was left. Very little was left, middle class education, some other things. But the question is, are we going to be able to do it now? I think that's a big question for the whole conference, so I'll stop at that. Second, there's the problem of inequality, of course. Inequality, which is not just that we have too many poor, is that we have still a lot of discrimination and severe breaches in society, which are a big problem. Social inclusion is certainly the answer, but we haven't gone very far in that, even though we have progress. But if I had to choose one in which we have not made progress, it's not the two that I already mentioned, it's the third one, which is the problem of crime and organized crime, which really is a challenge for all the region. I would say, of course, for some countries much more than others. The figures, the numbers are not the same for every country or every sub-region, but organized crime, the entrenchment of criminal societies that deal not only with drugs. Probably drugs is what feeds the money, but they deal with human traffic, and they deal with theft of intellectual property, and they deal with the prostitution, and they deal with the money laundering, and that's growing every time more. I mean, some people, about 10 years ago, when we had summits and all that, nobody spoke about that. Now we're having our General Assembly in El Salvador on the issue of crime, and it's in the agenda also of the presidents for next year for the Summit of the Americas, because it is a very serious challenge for the region. So if I had to choose between these three challenges, I would say, of course, the two are very important, but we have made some progress. In the other one, we don't. Personally, you already gave the answer. I mean, the biggest challenge at the OAS is to convince everybody that this is a multinational institution, not a supranational institution, so we have to deal with 34 countries, 35 actually. Cuba is a member of the OAS, even though it has not been there for a long time. But there are 34 acting countries which are really all of the mind that the OAS should do what they wanted to do without looking very much at the difference among them. Since differences have increased among countries, because there are political differences that probably did not exist before, This has become every more, it's a challenge, an everyday challenge. I think we are managing well, even though we get beaten up by both sides in one moment or the other, but it's, I would say, the limitation of an international institution, which is shared, by the way, with most of the other international institutions in the world.
Thank you, Secretary General. Enrique Iglesias, for many years, was called Mr. Latin America. He represented Latin America in all the important forums at the global level. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs of his native Uruguay. Then he worked at CEPAL. And then for many years, he was the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, and he's now the Secretary General of SEGIB, la Secretaría General Iberoamericana, based in Madrid. Enrique has seen everything and a lot of what we are talking about in terms of the evolution of this multilateral system of global governance, and he has been part of the successes, and he has also witnessed the challenges, the failures. We have seen at the same time that these institutions some of them are losing effectiveness. There seems to be a proliferation, an explosion of organizations. Just as we speak, and as Minister Patriota said, as we're sitting here, a new multilateral organization is being created, the CELAC. Meanwhile, we have another one called CELA. It used to be very important in the 70s and 80s, and that now is being rejuvenated. Could we talk about the fact that in the same way that countries can be failed countries, meaning that they exist and they have a semblance of, they really don't work. Can we say that there are, at the global level, failed international organizations, meaning that they have a building and a logo and a budget and people that go and work there, but they do not really exist?
Primeiro, gostaria de dizer que estou muito feliz de estar aqui em Rio de Janeiro e também visitar o Brasil, este querido país. Congratulations for the organization of this meeting, Marisol and Klaus. Really, it's a wonderful event. Once again, you are doing a very good job. It's a difficult question, your question, because I've been running institutions for all my life, so it's very difficult but let me tell you the following thing, very simple, a little bit. I think in a way the world is becoming global, not only economically, socially, politically, and we are full of global problems, and we are global of the need for global solutions. That explains why there has been so many institutions who want to run over these challenges, and this imply governments committing themselves to do something in some multilateral fora. This is very, very much the sign of the post-war, since the Second World War to here. Now, what is the key of the success of this and the relevance of these institutions? It means not only success and relevance. Well, first of all, that the governments really commit themselves to comply with what they want to achieve in these institutions. Without governmental support, it's very difficult to do really good job. It's impossible. Secondly, we need to have enlightened and efficient leadership and efficient bureaucracies, no question about that. But also, we need to look ahead in terms of expanding those institutions becoming really full of representativity. For instance, Latin America is becoming now a powerful emerging market, and therefore its weight in those institutions should be really reflected properly. We should be in the UN and the Security Council. We should be really presented there as part of the institutions who are running the international situation. In essence, my answer to your question will be the following. I had a friend of mine, Uruguayan friend, who used to say that he has been in many funerals of international organizations, but in no burial. And this is true, but probably it's true, and the question is, there are two ways to die. One is to die legally, the other way is to die for the lack of relevance. In order to have relevance, we need good leadership and bureaucracy, but we need also the support of the governments. And this is something which sometimes is lacking. In the case of Latin America, don't be surprised. In Latin America, there is a movement in the last 15 or 10 years for regionalism. The country wants to become themselves owner of their own problems. And this is very much it's a positive sign. That explains a little bit this proliferation. But what we need is to have really a renewal of the institutions more than creation of new ones. In the meantime, we must live with them.
Thank you. Renewal instead of creation, it's a good theme. Martin Sorrell is the co-chair of this meeting. He's also the CEO of WPP, one of the world's largest media and communications companies. Globalization for many countries is a threat, it is a headache, is a complication, but for many companies, globalization is a friend. And so there is this asymmetry in which governments have a hard time working across borders, but companies like WPP thrive by working across borders. Tell us, Martin, about that asymmetry, and other than the obvious, are there any lessons that governments can learn from highly globalized, very connected, very fast companies that work at the global level and use the new tools of globalization to be more effective, whereas governments often are hampered by these new tools?
Well, I hesitate, Moses, to give people who know far more about Latin America and the world than I do, or ever will do, any advice. But it won't stop me. I'll just keep going. I think there are some things. As you were asking the question when we were doing our preparatory work about governments versus companies, or the symmetry or asymmetry, it struck me that if you think about companies now, in a sense, and this may be many people in the audience won't like this, but many companies are effectively governments. I mean, I'm just thinking about Facebook. It has 600 million members, makes it the third largest country in the world. You have China Mobile with 650 million subscribers, probably going up by about 8 million a month. You have 3 mobile networks in India, Airtel, Reliance, and Vodafone, all with more than 100 million subscribers. And you have Walmart, which on its own is the 7th largest country in the planet by retail sales. So the complexity and the power of these organizations is considerable. We have 140,000 people around the world, and we operate in 107 countries, and we've been in existence for 25 years. And you mentioned Google and Apple, which are now in market cap terms, maybe with the exception of ExxonMobil, two of the most the two most highly valued companies in the world. So these things are very, very complex. I just want to pick up on a comment about history. When I first came to Brazil in 1968, I read a book by Inside South America by John Gunter. I remember reading it on the plane. And I was a failed Cambridge economist, and Rostow wrote about the stages of economic growth. I remember in my degree reading it. And there was always the takeoff stage. And Gunter wrote that Brazil and Latin America had always threatened to take off, but never had. It mentioned the full start that you mentioned at the end of the 19th century. But I see things much more long range. I believe in much more long-term swings. And for 200 years, India, China, and other parts of the world, what Goldman now calls the BRICS or the Next 11, what The Economist calls the civets, amongst other countries, these countries are achieving the same levels, or will achieve the same levels of GMP penetration that we saw 200 years ago. So nothing is new. This is back to the future stuff. And I think you've got to put it in that historical perspective. There's another issue that I think is really fundamental here. The West, I think, post-Lehman, or during the process of the subprime crisis, the insurance monoline crisis, which started in August of 2007 and culminated in Bear Stearns and Lehman, lost its sort of moral economic authority. And what you've seen, and we see this markedly in China and India, and I think we see it in Brazil. In my visit just in the last few days, and I come to Brazil fairly regularly, maybe once or twice a year, the authority that the West maybe rightfully had in terms of experience really disappeared. And you hear it with President Lula's comment about blue-eyed bankers several months ago, years ago. You hear it when you listen to some of the things that you hear from the Chinese leadership about US-China relationships. It's a fractured world. I don't think I go as far as Ian Bremmer to say it's G0, but there is the threat of G0. And I get a little bit worried when I hear these very learned gentlemen, or at least one or two of them, say we're becoming regionally concentrated in Latin America. I think that's sort of dangerous ground. Now, coming to the lessons that you might learn from corporations, because corporations make terrible mistakes, as we well know. We have a long-term view. No, it's not 200-year view, but we have a long-term view. The trouble with politics and governments is it's short-term. If you look at deficit reduction at the moment, the British government is involved in deficit reduction. Why? Because it has a 5-year run. The American government is shying away from deficit reduction because it has an election coming within, well, you could argue the election is already on. The Obama administration is raising money for an election already, and governments will spend about $4 billion on the election over the next, $4 billion over the election in the next few months. It's a very short-term attitude. Corporations are much more long-term in their attitude and their approach, and that has to be the case. I know it's a controversial thing to talk about long-term governments in terms that go beyond 2, but you take Mayor Bloomberg in New York. I think one of the reasons for his successes is the fact he's in his 3rd term, and he gets a longevity and a long-term view. The second thing is, I think it's about authority, and this is what worries me, is what's happened in the last year or so, that the West has lost its authority, and China, India, and Brazil, really, just taking them as examples, have no need to take the lessons from the West. And that inside corporations, what we are trying to do, what I'm trying to do at WPP, and it's an impossible dream, is get every one of the 140,000 people to know what the other 139,999 know. If I can achieve that, if I can avoid reinventing the wheel continuously in the 107 countries we operate in, or in the 2,400 offices, that will be an achievement. There's also an issue about balance, because the biggest challenge I think that multinationals are going to face is changing the balance. Inside most companies, which tend to be Western-based, tend to be Anglo-American, European-American, the balance of power inside those organizations resides in the US, in the UK, in France, in Germany, Italy, and Spain. That has to change, because the delta and the growth that is coming from those companies, the delta is coming from these new markets, from the BRICS, the Next 11, and the civets. And it takes a long time for that to filter through. And people will get increasingly frustrated if they provide the resource and the growth, not to share in the rewards of growth. So it's a bit like the governance system. If you exclude from the organizational structures of these countries, you have a problem. So I think those are some of the things that we think about. Just one other observation about Latin America that sort of troubles me. It's the dominance of Brazil. And I shouldn't say this sitting here in Rio, but I will. Somebody I know very well in Brazil was in London. We were having dinner, and I said to him, how's Latin America? Brazilian. And he said, we don't know. In Brazil, we don't know. We just focus on Brazil. There is an issue because of language, I think, and an issue about coordination and bringing together Brazil in the context of Latin America as a whole. If I look at our own operation, we have $1.3 billion of revenue, 650 million occurs here in Brazil, and Brazil dominates. And I'll just give you one little, I went to Uruguay for the first time, and I sat with our people in Uruguay, a dozen of them, one morning for breakfast, and we talked about Uruguay, and we talked about the growth and development of Uruguay. 3 million people, heavy IT, tax-free zones for manufacturing and export, emphasis on computers, computer literacy and internet development. And then we started to talk about Paraguay. 10 million people, relatively small country in the context of Latin America and the world, but very strong GDP growth. Big opportunities in terms of commodities, agricultural land and development. So the point I'm making, it's not just Brazil, and we focus on Brazil. It's not just Russia in the context of Central Eastern Europe, it's Poland. It's not just India or China in the context of Asia, it's more than that. So look at it as a region, yes, look at it globally, but not just Brazil.
Thank you, Martin. Very interesting. I know that this will spark a very interesting exchange between you. Minister Patriota, I think I should give you the floor So first, Latin America is not about Brazil. Second, solely about Brazil. No, but the big theme here is the dominance of Brazil that generates great hopes and expectations, but a lot of anxieties. It's normal in international relations when you have a very large country, neighbors and others fret about a very large country. So, Minister Patriota, other than stating explicitly, as you have and very eloquently that Brazil is and has a very strong commitment to the region, there surely are frictions with the region. There surely are areas where Brazil has to balance competing goals, as every superpower has to do. One issue is Brazil, with its access and influence in global forum. Does it represent Latin America or does it represent Brazil? And that is a question that is frequently asked in the context of Brazil's very legitimate aspiration to be a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. Let me leave you with that and with a very specific question associated to the second one. Do you think you're going to get it? Do you think Brazil is going to become a permanent member of the Security Council?
This is an exercise in futurology, and I don't think diplomats should be futurologists. We should plan for the future and examine scenarios, and certainly if one looks at the way the debate is evolving today, I think there would be widespread recognition that this is an issue that has only gained in significance over time. I used to deal with this issue back at the Brazilian mission to the United Nations in the mid-90s, and in those years a lot of people would say, oh, you know, this is never going to happen, you know, don't waste your time. Nowadays it'll be very hard to find a diplomat anywhere in the world who will say this is an irrelevant issue. It's one of the most important issues when you speak of global governance. And I would even add that since the G20 replaced the G8 to a large extent, I think it has come even higher up to the forefront of the international agenda, because it's become very clear that this is where we have to work to complete our duties in shaping institutions that reflect 21st century economic or geopolitical realities. But if you allow me, you had asked our colleague Enrique Iglesias about whether institutions or multilateral organizations can die or peter out or something of the nature. That is one possibility, and sometimes actually they can be replaced by something different. You mentioned CELAC. CELAC will incorporate the Rio Group, for example, which was a mechanism, a forum that came into being during the years of the civil wars in Central America. But a more serious concern for us is not an organization dying or withering away, but is something that I would call systemic failure. And what would that mean? That would be through a failure of reforming the Security Council, for example, we evolve into an international system whereby groups of countries, coalitions, or regions of countries take it upon themselves to promote their view of international peace and security, or their view of stability, irrespective of international law, irrespective of what we have as a universal system, which is the one enshrined in the UN Charter. So this is what I think also prompts the need for Security Council reform. And rather than speaking about Brazil's aspiration or any individual aspiration, I think what Brazil is very concerned about is creating a system that works, that is reflective of today's realities, and that will prevent this kind of systemic failure from coming into being.
Minister, I'd be remiss if I don't take this opportunity to give you an opportunity to explain to this audience Brazil's vote concerning Libya. Together with the other countries, you essentially abstained on the notion of on the proposal in the United Nations. That perplexed many countries, and so briefly tell us the rationale behind Brazil abstention in the case of the Libyan initiative.
Well, in a nutshell, because it would take some time to give a very full picture of the situation. But I think on Libya, the interesting phenomenon was that the first manifestations of the international community were consensus manifestations. So when the Human Rights Council examined the situation of the violence against unarmed civilians, there was a consensus resolution that led to the suspension of Libya from the Human Rights Council. Libya had already been suspended from the Arab League, which was also a very interesting consensus manifestation by the entire Arab world. And the first Security Council resolution, which was 1970 on Libya, that established an arms embargo, that froze the assets of Gaddafi and his team, and that submitted the Libyan situation to the International Criminal Court, was also adopted by consensus. Now, when we came to another initiative that essentially was to bring to the Security Council the proposal for the establishment of a no-fly zone that again had been asked or requested by the Arab League, the expectation was that this could also be adopted by consensus. And my own opinion is that if we had restricted ourselves to that agenda, we would have kept the consensus approach. What happened is that a group of countries considered that they needed an authorization, a very wide authorization, a wide window, or almost a blank check for using military force allegedly to protect civilians. And this is where a large number of countries, and you know, the Security Council this year has a very interesting configuration because all the BRICS are in there, some as non-permanent members, of course, Brazil, India, and South Africa, in addition to other important countries such as Nigeria and Germany, for example.
And Colombia.
Colombia, obviously, from the region. And it was interesting to see that the BRICS, if you take out South Africa, that is now a BRIC also, but Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Germany all abstained because they all had the same concern that this window that was opened through paragraph 4 of Resolution 1973 was a little bit too wide. And what we are witnessing today is not a reduction in the level of violence in Libya, but in fact a stalemate, a continuation of the struggle, whereas what we would highlight and what we would like to emphasize and privilege are diplomatic efforts to impose a ceasefire and to protect civilians through that and to establish a political procedure. This is why we have been very supportive of what the African Union in particular has been trying to establish through efforts by President Jacob Zuma of South Africa and others. They have created a roadmap through a meeting that we attended in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia that essentially tries to obtain the same objectives through diplomatic means.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, Minister. Secretary Insulza, this example just illustrates a broader trend, which is the complicated relationship between Latin America and the United States. This is a case in which the two largest countries in the hemisphere, the United States and Brazil, simply had very different views of what to do in the case of a specific international security issue in Libya. Mm-hmm. But you have to live with that inside the OAS all the time. The United States is a very important member of your organization, is the country that I think it's the largest contributor to your budget, by 60%, I believe. 60% of your of the OAS comes from the United States, and yet Latin American countries have always had this complicated relationship with the United States and vice versa. As a result, part of the proliferation of this new organization is everyone except the United States. So the creation of CELAC is in many ways is the continuation to something we had called GRULAC, which is all of Latin American countries except the United States and Canada. So that's not your case, Secretary Insulza. You have to run an organization that has these two giants that very often have different views. So I wanted you to give you an opportunity to discuss that tension between Latin America and the United States.
First, let me say that in this matter of international activity, I think you have to distinguish between organizations and what we call forum or commonwealth or whatever, which actually try to coordinate positions among countries but do not have a strong secretariat and very clearly mandated roles. I mean, I think that the OAS will always have a certain advantage, which other organizations want to be well in taking over also, which is the fact that we are, if I can say it in just a few words, it's not properly said, but a few words, is the owner of all inter-American law. I mean, when the presidents meet at the Rio Group to solve the problem between Colombia and Ecuador, they meet at the Rio Group, but in the statements they all quote the Charter of the OAS, when the countries that are cooperating with Haiti decide to take an initiative in regards with the election, there were some problems there, they all say, well, where are we going to do it? Well, the only organization in which they have the tools, the legal tools to do it, is the Organization of American States. So I'm not really concerned about that. I am more concerned about the beginning of your question. Because if we don't discuss global issues at the OAS, it's not because Latin American countries don't want it, but because the U.S. has never chosen to take those issues into the Organization of American States, and certainly that's a shortcoming. I don't foresee a moment in which that might happen, in which the U.S. will say, look, what do the rest of the Americans think that we should do with Libya or with whatever? I mean, the U.S. is a global power, and usually the interests that our organization deals with are regional interests and not global interests. And that's a fact. It's a fact of life. I mean, and I think it's absolutely proper that countries of Latin America and the Caribbean get together to share their views and try to work together in a global arena in which there are no other partners, I would say. Those are the partners. If you are going to discuss the problems of a political nature dealing with other regions, probably the OAS is not the place in which you're going to do it. Sometimes I make statements on the matter. That's another thing. As Secretary General, I think that the OAS should have, at least the Secretary should have a certain opinion, but it's probably not the place to do it. But the issue therefore, the institutional issue is not something that worries me. I think that for a long time we will have organizations which are regional, if you want, the UNASUR, the SICA, the CARICOM, because this is a continent of regions. I mean, the diversity has to do with that. And what I would call hemispheric organizations, which from my point of view are really 3 or 4. One is the IDB, the OAS, and ECLAC, CEPAL, which is it belongs to the United Nations, but it operates for every purpose as an inter-American organization. Then we will have the SEGIB, which has been developed for a long time as a special relationship with the countries from which most of our nations come from. But I think that doesn't preclude to have forum and places in which I do believe, however, I must say something, that probably something called the organization, or no, the Commonwealth of Caribbean States. I'm not talking about CARICOM, but the Association of Caribbean States, probably in between the CELAC and the CARICOM will have very little space to work. Probably the CELAC, which you mentioned, which is strangely an organization, economic of course, but it's an organization that was born more than 30 years ago, and it has a secretariat, by the way, in Caracas, where the CELAC was held. And all the countries of the Americas, except Canada and the United States, belong to it. But for some reason or other, it's not even discussed in this area, so probably that will have to be reviewed. I don't think that and by the way, I should say, probably there are not too many organizations and forums. You can go to all of them. There are too many summits. I mean, presidents, there are presidents in Latin America who go to at least 10 summits a year, if not 12. And that, from my point of view, is something that's not functional to the kind of policy we like to make. And I would like to say just one thing about I think that for some reason, the Brazilian, I think that the presence of a Latin American country in the Security Council would certainly strengthen very much the unity and capacity of an action in the region. And I said this when I was Foreign Minister of Chile about 13 years ago, and I believe much more in it now. I think that it's not that Brazil would represent, that we would have to all meet first and then Brazil would go and say exactly what, no, but the fact that Latin America would be represented, which is not the same, would be there, I think would be very positive for the region. So I'm very much in favor of that. I'm very much in favor of first of a larger number members at the UN Security Council. 192 members would perfectly give room for 20 countries at the Security Council. And I'm very much in favor of the participation of some other countries as permanent members. I have no argument in my head about Brazil and about India. I would probably like to see a little bit more about who else would be there, because more European countries will probably be a problem. And if the European Union has a certain kind of supranationality, maybe somebody should think about that too. I'm not really sure. But the fact that it will be, I think that Latin America should be there, and not with I will say somebody representing, I mean, some chosen representative, with the largest country in the region, I think is probably the most reasonable thing to do.
Thank you. And it is ironic that at a time in which we have an explosion in communications and tools and video conferencing, we have also a booming summit business. Just like Davos. Not like Davos. Davos is much better. Enrique, I wanted you to engage with Martin on the issue of his concern about hyper-regionalism. He didn't call it that way. But the notion of being too consumed with what's happening in the region and not looking at the broader world, in which Latin America can then just spend all of these summits looking at very regional things, and instead of engaging the larger, broader issues that are global in nature.
Well, but I think this can be seen also as a very positive thing. I think it's very important that Latin America talks about what they can do together. And this is not new. I think probably this region is the oldest in terms of looking to cooperation among themselves. 50 years ago, we started the cooperation in integration in Uruguay with the creation of Halal. And this is not a new thing now. What we have seen now is that growing economic linkages in Latin America. There should be more than it is, but it is a fact. And also, let me tell you, I think in many aspects, this region is an example of cooperation among itself. And this is good. I think I'm very much in favor of that. And the OES, what they just Insulza has mentioned is correct. There is a lot of institutional building around this cooperation which no other region has. And this is Latin America. I think in the world of tomorrow, this is an asset. Because I think confronting the insecurities of the world, the fact that we can act together, particularly expanding the economic cooperation, is a tremendous element of security for the future. I am very much in favor of expanding the regional relations and the regional cooperation in economic and social issues, because that will give Latin America a more capacity to compete openly in the markets and to be also a very good international area. And the more we can work among ourselves, the more we can be good participants in the construction of a better world. So for me, the regionalism, look as it is now, is a positive fact and must be respected and supported. We are working now from my own job now, which is this Iberoamerican community, these 22 countries. We have 19 countries in Latin America speaking French, speaking Spanish and Portuguese, and other 3 in the Iberian Peninsula. We always said that we must support this regionalism in Latin America. It's a good thing. This does not preclude that we should not also, in order to be positive players in the world, we need to have a strength in Latin America. That is a good, in Caribbean. I think this is good for everybody.
Thank you, Martin. You want to react to?
I use China as a proxy for what we're talking about. China, I don't think, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert on China either, but I don't think it has a regional view of the world, as you've intimated. If I think about what China is doing, and I'm struck by the statistics that when President Lula took power here in Brazil, I think 32% of trade was with the United States. It's now roughly half that level. And the biggest trade partner is China. And China thinks about the world in a very different way. I think it does think about, obviously, the contiguous regions in which it operates in Asia, Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia, etc. But it thinks about, I was struck when I was in Nassau. I went there for a Viacom management conference, and I'm being driven by a taxi driver through Nassau, and he shows shows me the old hotels in Nassau, and says the harbour is being redeveloped. And I said, how much is it going to cost? He said, $3.2 billion. I said, who's financing it? The Chinese investment bank. And by the way, they built a basketball court there as well. Not an inexpensive one, but not that expensive. The penetration and the thinking and the planning, this sort of subtle, soft diplomacy, is not a regional-based diplomacy. It's in Africa. They have 800,000 Chinese in one way or another doing projects in Africa. So whilst the West, the US, the British, the French, are focused on Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, China is really moving in a sort of the soft underbelly of our foreign policy, Western foreign policy, into Africa, into the Middle East, and into Latin America too. And I think this is a very different way. I'm a great admirer of the state-planned, state-directed capitalist system. I mean, the 12th plan that they just brought out is really interesting. Shifting to consumption, away from saving, providing a healthcare net for the population because they save because they're worried about their old age and their health, and actually moving to services. It's a wonderful charter actually for WPP in China, the 12th five-year plan. But it's a very different view of the world, and I think that's important.
Thank you. Antonio.
Yeah, I just thought of making one or two comments about this idea that we may be too self-consumed with the region in Latin America. First of all, if you look at the private sector, the Brazilian private sector, I think the opposite is true. Historically, I think São Paulo, for example, Fiesp, and other institutions were very much
Fiesp is the private sector organization.
The private sector, yeah, conglomerate of São Paulo, were very much tuned into closer relations with the North, with the developed world, which they still are, with the United States, the European Union, Japan, etc. But what I've been sensing, which is new and interesting in my own context with the private sector in São Paulo, is a growing sense that our future is linked to South America, our future is linked to the region. So it's a little bit the opposite of what some people may think. That's one point. Another point is that something very new is developing also in what concerns South America in particular, which is for the first time in history probably, we are having direct contacts with other regions of the South without going through Europe, without going through the North. So today there is a South America Arab World Summit, another summit that has met since 2005 here in Brazil. There is a South America Africa Summit. There are direct flights from São Paulo to Qatar and to the United Arab Emirates. This is quite revolutionary when you think about it, because our view historically of what the Middle East was about, what Africa was about, what the Far East was about, went through a Eurocentric or American-centric perception. And these new linkages that are being established, including through the BRICS and through another grouping called IBSA, which brings together India, Brazil, and South Africa, have now created a possibility for direct dialogue and direct knowledge and a filling of the knowledge gap between our part of the world and Africa, Middle East, Asia, etc. I think this has far-reaching implications also, and is very much a symptom of a growing multipolarity which affects all of us.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but yes, you can briefly.
No, just to say, following what the minister just said, I think one of the best examples of success of regionalism are the multilatinas, las empresas multilatinas. There are probably a few of them here. Enterprises who made their space in Latin America and then projected themselves abroad. There are more than 60 enterprises now, big enterprises, who have more assets invested outside of Latin America than in Latin America. This is in a way a byproduct of regionalism too. They started to practice their cooperation in the region and then they move outside of the region.
Thank you. The organizers have asked me to try to summarize and give an answer to the central question of this session, which is how Latin America best contribute to reshaping the global governance system. And I will not attempt to do that other by saying that Latin America has greatly contributed in the last decade to do that just by being what they are. And that is, they have now become stable countries. As the rest of the world was crashing, Latin America was growing and serving as the locomotive of other countries, and Brazil took the lead in that. As Secretary Insulza said, this is a region that doesn't have suicidal terrorists, doesn't have nuclear weapons, doesn't have the sorts of conflicts that are now creating a lot of instability. So in many ways, paradoxically, and to the surprise of the rest of the world, Latin America has become a region that irradiates stability to the rest of the world. And that is, I think, a very welcome change that I think and I hope will stay with us for a while. We are not without problems and we are not without challenges, and they are very evident. But our profound transformation into a source of stability for the world is here to stay. Before thanking the panelists, I have to ask you to stay in your seats, because one of the most wonderful things that the World Economic Forum and the Schwab Foundation has invented is the whole concept of social entrepreneurs and recognizing them. And so we will have a few minutes to, Professor Schwab will come and recognize and give the award for the Social Entrepreneur of the Year. But before that, please join me in thanking Martin Sorrell, Minister Antonio Patriota, Secretary General José Miguel Insulza, Secretary General Enrique Iglesias for a wonderful, interesting conversation.
Let me just take some minutes for something which is very close to my heart. As you know, the World Economic Forum is the foremost global multi-stakeholder organization, and I believe one of the solutions to all the issues which we have in the world on a global or regional basis is to work much better together as a multi-stakeholder platform, because the big challenges in the world cannot be solved by governments alone or by business alone or by NGOs alone. I think we need cooperation. And maybe a second remark, also seen from the perspective of the World Economic Forum, you cannot solve global issues or regional issues by optimizing national solutions. I think you have to act today, where we are living in such an interconnected world, you have to act as a true global trustee, and that's what we are trying to do. Now, coming from the very macro to the very micro, among the many stakeholders we have, young global leaders, religious leaders, I could go on and on. We have one which I feel is particularly important for social change. I speak about the social entrepreneurs. What we are doing in the forum, we are cultivating a community of the best social entrepreneurs in the world, whom we select together with partners, mainly newspapers, and we honor those social entrepreneurs as examples and as role models all over the world. And in each of our regional meetings, we honor the regional entrepreneurs of the year of the region, and in this case, of Latin America. And they have been selected from over here in Latin America. I have to make a compliment. I think Latin America is the region with the highest density of social entrepreneurs. So we have today an opportunity at the end of this opening session to honor 5 social entrepreneurs who, 6 I think, who have really excelled and who have been chosen from over 600 people whom we have thoroughly do our diligence on. And Miriam Schönig, who is the director of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship, will present rapidly all those social entrepreneurs who have joined us here this afternoon.
It is an honor to present to you the 5 Social Entrepreneurs of the Year from Latin America. We will start with our Brazilian winner, Dr. Roberto Kikawa, from Projeto CIES. Dr. Kikawa is a renowned gastroenterologist in Brazil. He's also a great inventor. He has devised the world's largest mobile medical center in the world. This hospital, in a van, as you can see here on the screen, delivers very specialized high-technology medical care, such as mammography or endoscopy, to very rural areas in Brazil, as well as Brazil's favelas. In the last 2 years, Projeto CIES has treated more than 24,000 people, and the vans are also sold through a social business to other countries in Latin America, as well as Africa. Once again, congratulations, Dr. Kikawa. Next from Chile, Thomas Ricard, founder of Enseña Chile. Inspired by the work of Teach for America, Tomás returned to Chile after his studies in Harvard to start Enseña Chile. Enseña Chile recruits Chile's prominent future leaders from different professional backgrounds to teach in public schools in low-income communities for 2 years. As they experience what it means to transform the lives of hundreds of kids, they become part of a movement of leaders that will then advocate for the future educational reform in Chile. Enseña Chile has been poised for very fast growth. In 2009, it selected 29 teachers to work in 14 schools. Barely 1.5 years later, more than 100 teachers in 40 schools are reaching 13,000 children. Congratulations, Tomás Ricard. Our third winner comes from Venezuela, Claudia Valladares, from Banca Comunitario Banesco. Claudia Valladares started Banca Comunitaria within Banesco to bring financial services to the 40% of the Venezuelan population that is underbanked. Banca Comunitaria provides access to savings accounts and microcredits, particularly specializing in small businesses. With its network of more than 180 retail agents across the country, Banesco has reached more than 100,000 individuals and small businesses. It rigorously tracks not only its financial results, but its social impact with more than 16 indicators. Congratulations to Claudia Valladares. Next, Felipe Vergara, founder of Lumni. Felipe Vergara was shocked to see that his best high school friend, a most gifted mathematician, was unable to attend university simply because his parents could not afford it. After leaving a career as a consultant, he decided to start Lumni to precisely address this issue and help students like his former friend, or his friend, sorry. Lumni now creates capital funds that invest in high potential students across various disciplines, including, for example, teaching and nursing. After graduations, students pay back a fixed percentage of their income for a fixed amount of months. On average, they earn 3 to 6 times more than they would have earned without that university degree. To date, Lumni has financed students in Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and in the US. Congratulations to Felipe Vergara. And now coming to our final winner, we have from Mexico, Francesco Piazzesi. Francesco founded Échale a tu Casa, which helps the poorest communities in Mexico to build and improve their homes. Échale trains individuals in construction skills using local earth-proof materials such as compressed earth blocks, and helps create micro construction industries in the respective communities. In addition, HLA offers financial services, financial education, and partners with the government to extend mortgages to families. Nearly 26,000 homes have been built through HLA, and the micro-construction industries have generated 130,000 jobs. Congratulations to Francesco Piazzesi. All these winners will join the Schwab Foundation community and actively contribute to World Economic Forum events and activities. So you will see more of them in the coming years. And we hope that this distinction, along with the forum community, will help accelerate the tremendous impact that they are reaching for the benefit of Latin America. Let me also at this point quickly thank our partners that have been very instrumental in identifying particularly our social entrepreneurs in Venezuela, Fundación Venezuela Sin Límites, in Chile, El Mercurio, in Brazil, Folha do Sao Paulo, and for the Latin American region, the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you.
This concludes our opening session, and again I would like to express our congratulations to the winners and our thanks to the panelists.